Welcome to this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, a constitutional attorney here at FFRF.
I'm Amit Pal, FFRF's Director of Communications.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, FFRF's Director of Strategic Response and a constitutional attorney here at FFRF. If you've got questions, please comment in the Facebook comments below, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. In today's show, we're going to talk about that ubiquitous religious phrase, "In God we trust."
So the phrase has a somewhat sordid history. The typical claim is that it goes back to the Star-Spangled Banner, and yes, a version of it does appear there, but that's always been a convenient post hoc rationalization for imposing religion on we the people. It first appeared on coins during the height of the Civil War, a catastrophically divisive time when the country was a bit busy with more important things.
But it wasn't until the 1950s that it appeared on paper currency, and not until 1956, as late as that it was adopted as our national motto. And of course, this was at the time of the Red Scare, a wave of fear and paranoia that Joe McCarthy wrote to notoriety and which quashed dissent, especially religious dissent.
In his book, One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, Princeton historian Kevin Kruse offers an amendment to this typical understanding. It wasn't the Red Scare and McCarthy that were the main contributors to the push to add God to the government in these small but significant ways, but actually it was corporate America. And they began the push on things like In God We Trust and One Nation Under God even earlier than the 1950s.
I realized I had to move the book back, and so I moved back to look at the creation of these phrases in the 50s. As I dug into that, I found another thread that took me back to the 30s and this origin of this corporate resistance that I say got this whole thing rolling. The head of the National Association of Manufacturers in 1940 basically gets the job when he makes a famous speech in 1939 to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he says quite explicitly, economic arguments are not working. We're still in public disfavor. What we need to do is play up to the American people's sense of patriotism and piety. And if we do that, then business will be restored. And so they're very open about this. And again, in their private letters, they say, well, who can we trust? The polls show ministers. Let's get a minister.
And this is what leads to the addition of In God We Trust to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954.
It's in 49 that this Freedom Under God message starts to get spread through the magazines and the radio program. In 1951 is that massive Freedom Under God ceremony where they've got this radio program. They've got 17,000 ministers across the country engaged in a sermon contest. They're competing for cash prizes to create sermons on this theme of freedom under God and the evils of the New Deal state. And this message gets out there broadly in 51, and the movement to add under God to the pledge starts just a few months thereafter, after this has been blanketing the airwaves.
I actually had to rewrite an entire chapter of my book because of all the great argument and research that Kevin Kruse relates in his book, which I cannot recommend highly enough. He's also been a good friend to me when it comes to research and writing my own book, so thanks, Kevin, if you're out there watching.
So the important point here is that whatever the motto's origins, they are recent, or at least they do not stem from America's founding, as many Christian nationalists will argue.
And I think it'll help our viewers to explain that this motto has been challenged in court many times. And Andrew actually wrote an article on this topic, and it's been one of our most popular because of how constantly and consistently this question comes up. Andrew and Liz, you're both lawyers. Can you tell us how a country that was the first to separate state and church in history got stuck with a motto that is so obviously religious?
Yeah, that's easy. It's actually because courts have said that the religious motto is not really religious. Yeah, that's right. Federal courts have ruled that the phrase no longer has any, quote, theological or ritualistic impact. So according to these courts, it's secular to adopt a motto that not only expounds a belief in God, but claims that all citizens trust in him.
Right. So courts have upheld many instances of ceremonial deism using this same rationale. So courts have called ceremonial deism things like prayers before legislative meetings, In God We Trust as the national motto, One Nation Under God in the pledge. And courts have have reasoned that these instances of ceremonial deism are no longer religious because, quote, any religious freight the words may have been meant to carry originally has long since been lost, end quote. And so, put that another way, by another case, these have, quote, lost through rote repetition any significant religious content.
And I've actually always hated that phrase, in God we trust can't be ceremonial deism. You don't trust in a deistic God because that God plays no role in this world. You trust in a theistic God that does supposedly play an active role. You don't pray to a deistic God. A deistic God is the divine watchmaker. It sets things into motion and that's it. So that God would never answer a prayer. It's the nature of a deist God not to be involved, where a theistic God would answer your prayer and get involved in everyday life. So ceremonial theism is actually the more appropriate term, but that's not an argument that I'm going to have with the court.
Yes, potato, potato. Whatever we call it, courts have said that it's okay, basically, because it's not religious. Obviously, this is a fiction, but in 1970, one federal court said this, quote, it's quite obvious that the national motto and the slogan on coinage and currency, "In God We Trust," has nothing whatsoever to do with the establishment of religion. Its use is of a patriotic or a ceremonial character and bears no true resemblance to a governmental sponsorship of a religious exercise. 26 years later, another court said, quote, a reasonable observer, aware of the purpose, context, and history of the phrase "In God We Trust," would not consider its use or its reproduction on U.S. currency to be an endorsement of religion. And in 2010, another court said, quote, the national motto is of a patriotic or ceremonial character, has no theological or ritualistic impact, and does not constitute governmental sponsorship of a religious exercise.
That's intriguing. To a layperson, this seems to be a contradiction and a bit hypocritical. Andrew?
I mean, to me, the hypocrisy is just breathtaking. Imagine for a moment if the courts had declared that John 3:16 or that praying the rosary had no theological or ritualistic importance because it had been so often repeated. The religious right would have a collective stroke. And what American Christian would let a court declare that his or her God is not religious, or that trusting in this God is not a religious declaration? Where are the usual suspects with their claims of religious persecution when no less than 9 federal courts have said that trusting in God is not religious? And to me, that's the hypocrisy. Christianity benefits when the federal courts declare that "In God We Trust" is not religious, since this allows Christians to use the machinery of the state to promote their personal religion.
Right. So whenever you see "In God We Trust" cut into coin or engraved on a government building or stuck on the side of a police car, just know that it is nothing more than a monument to religious hypocrisy.
So, Andrew and Liz, given these extensive court decisions, what can we do to stop this phrase being used this widely?
Well, so the law is not on our side. So grassroots action is the best solution. So what does that mean? That means citizens making their voices heard to oppose legislation or any other proposals of government displays of "In God We Trust." So for example, Andrew has been helping Floridians to stop a measure put forward by one state representative down there. Her name is Kimberly Daniels. Daniels' proposal is to put the phrase "In God We Trust" in every public school. And her mission to put God into the schools is a perfect example of how the phrase is religious, or it illustrates how the phrase is religious, no matter what the courts say.
Florida State Representative Kimberly Daniels is on a mission, a religious mission, to get organized religion back into the public schools.
To adopt rules that require all schools and all buildings used by the school to display in a conspicuous place the state motto, "In God We Trust."
In God she trusts, so she wants every public school to display "In God We Trust."
The spiritual air force and the demons in the air and on the earth. And
a self-proclaimed preacher and exorcist, she's never been shy about this theocratic goal, openly proclaiming it as she fights demons, battles witches, and breaks curses.
But God had to anoint me to go in the gates of the city, to go in the chambers of the city, to write laws and to be able to debate and write legislation so that his kingdom could come and manifest itself like never before. We have to be kingdom-minded.
no matter what realm we operate in. Even in every position that I hold, where I'm working in the professional arena, whether I'm working in the legislative arena, you have to be kingdom minded.
Theocracy of God, the kingdom agenda, as opposed to the government agenda.
I'm a commissioner in Jacksonville, Florida, and don't nobody tell me I can't pray nowhere. I can pray anywhere I go. Now you gonna let me swear in on the Bible and tell me I can't preach it? The devil is a liar.
Hey, come on! Hey, Shabbat, Basay, 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 Bashibaya. Hey, Alalabohosha.
That's just the beginning. Daniels has said and done far worse.
And you can talk about the Holocaust, but the Jews own everything. I thank God for slavery. I thank God for the crack house. If it wasn't for the crack house, come on somebody, God wouldn't have never been able to use me how he can use me now. And if it wasn't for slavery, I might be somewhere in Africa worshiping a tree.
In the United States, laws are only legitimate, constitutional, if they have a secular purpose. Daniels' only purpose is to promote her religion, to force her God onto other people's children.
I am an elected official. That's crazy. A demon buster that write laws.
That's an elected official openly talking about using her public office to promote her personal religion. That's basically, we're talking theocracy here. Now, because of the bad court decisions, we are more likely to win on these issues by beating them in the legislature. The courts are just not on our side, so you've got to make your voice heard now. That's why on the video we were asking people to text FFRF to 52886 and then input your contact information. Then when there is a proposal in your state or district, you'll be the first to know. So text FFRF to 52886. You won't be donating any money, but you will know when there's a bill that might violate state-church separation, and our system will actually help you contact your officials. It's really easy to do, and it takes less than 60 seconds, and we're actually probably going to put out a new action alert on the Florida In God We Trust because it looks like it's going to be going to the governor shortly.
And are there any other bad bills, egregious bills out there that we should know of?
There are. My team at FFRF here is actually tracking 5 other In God We Trust bills, including in Alabama, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And we're also tracking another in Arizona that would put the state motto, which is Ditat Deus, or God enriches, in every classroom. Interestingly, they're not going to put the Latin phrase, they're going to put the translation into English in the classrooms.
And are there any lawmakers, these lawmakers, are they worried at all that this will cause acrimony and division within public schools?
Well, they aren't, but they should be. And first of all, let me say, before acrimony and division, they should be concerned about legality. Because yes, we talked about courts upholding the motto itself and on currency, but none of those cases have upheld a law mandating the display of In God We Trust in every public school classroom. So we still question the constitutionality of using public schools to ensure that every single child is confronted with the phrase In God We Trust, or God enriches. But anyway, yes, to answer your question, like most things religious, the phrase is divisive. And that's another dead giveaway that the phrase is and was meant to be religious, whatever the courts have said, because E Pluribus Unum, our original motto, out of many one, never brought citizens out to public meetings with torches and pitchforks to protest. But in Wentzville, Missouri, just speaking out against displaying the phrase In God We Trust was enough to get Sally Hunt kicked out of a public meeting by the mayor.
So I came here because it was brought to my attention, this sign as I see it right here, the very large letters in the center, In God We Trust. This is a legislative body that represents we, the people. That means all of us. All religious beliefs and lack thereof. If it's not about religion, then why is it that every person who defends this so aggressively and does so with curse words and with all capital letters and very angry, Why? Why do they do that? Why do they care? It's obviously, there's a reason why.
Your
Thank you.
comments.
Oh,
Thank you. The next speaker I have is John Weber. I'd like to talk about HOA meetings.
Let's go. And the reason, what is the reason I'm being dragged out?
Ma'am, let's go.
What's the reason that you're asking them to take me out? Is there an actual reason? Right, my time's up and I sat down right.
FFRF wrote a letter to the mayor explaining why his treatment of Miss Hunt was illegal. And we wrote that with our friends at the American Humanist Association, and both groups are working to help Sally. She defended her position on Fox News the other night.
Well, I didn't say that it is the establishment of religion, but it is certainly the endorsement and the advancement of religion by our government. So it should send everybody over the edge if they value the U.S. Constitution, and I do.
Now, Ingram is an attorney who actually clerked for Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, so she's a formidable opponent, and she had on a state senator to help her with Sally. I thought Sally did quite well given how hard those interviews can be and how adept Fox News is at forcing atheists into the stereotypes that their viewers expect. Now, with her ostentatious cross gleaming on camera, Ingram herself gets pretty worked up in that interview, which again just shows that this is not about anything other than religion. The motto is religious, and it's always meant to be religious.
So to sum up, the phrase is religious, but courts have said it's not. That's the conundrum or the paradox. The phrase is divisive, but it's our national motto. And the best way for people to oppose it is by texting FFRF, our acronym, to 52886 and giving us their contact information. Our system will help them then contact lawmakers when proposals like this come up.
And I think now we'll go ahead and take any questions that you folks may have. Again, you can submit your questions to FFRF's email, askanatheist@ffrf.org, or you can just comment right below. Our first question comes from Sarah Bonilla, who says that if courts say "in God we trust" isn't really a religious phrase, is this the same argument that they use for having 10 commandments on government property or having crosses on public land?
Well, no, I think, in a word. The rationale that's been used to say that "in God we trust" is, ceremonial deism, and therefore is no longer religious and doesn't have a religious significance, is a bit unique, I think.
It is.
It's not exactly the same BS that's been used to uphold other religious monuments on public property. And certainly I would say courts have not been as uniformly willing to permit other religious displays in any context, certainly not with crosses. I think with crosses on public property, the case law is certainly with us, not against us. There's no Latin cross on public property that's been upheld in the courts. And so those are still challenges that are we're fighting in the traditional way in court as violations of the Establishment Clause. 10 Commandments, we do have some conflicting court cases on whether 10 Commandments are allowed on public property. The one bad case that I'm thinking of that's out there is Van Orden, and that upheld a 10 Commandments display on the Texas State Capitol grounds. And the reason given by the court was sort of along the idea that it didn't have a religious, that the 10 Commandments in that particular display didn't have a religious purpose or effect. But more was a sort of acceptance that it represented a historical part of, it was a historical piece of a larger, broader historical civic display all over the Capitol grounds that included a number of other items. And so given the setting and the broader context, the Ten Commandments in that context didn't have as a religious significance. But I don't think courts certainly have not uniformly held that the Ten Commandments don't have a religious significance. In fact, to the contrary, there are many cases holding that Ten Commandments on public property are unconstitutional endorsements of religion, that the Ten Commandments are clearly Christian, have sectarian religious significance. And so they're definitely nowhere near the same realm as In God We Trust in terms of how they've been treated by the courts.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. There was just a case out of New Mexico that struck down a Ten Commandments monument out of the 10th Circuit. That cost the city $700,000. The Supreme Court declined to review that case. So there are plenty of decisions striking down Ten Commandments monuments. And actually on the decision you mentioned, Van Orden, the Supreme Court issued another decision that same day, McCreary County, where they struck down a couple Ten Commandments monuments displays to make it as confusing as possible for everybody. So courts have come out both ways on Ten Commandments monuments, mostly in favor of striking them down, and never have they has a court of final resort upheld a cross on public land. So I think
we know, Liz and Andrew, because along with other secular groups, we've been in the forefront of challenging Ten Commandments plaques and crosses consistently, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Quite right.
I think Patrick actually just got a victory on a Ten Commandments monument that we're going to be reporting later this week. And of course, we've done many court cases on crosses, memorably the one in Whiteville where they ripped an arm off the cross to fix the constitutional violation. Jesus was an amputee. All right, Jackie Barrow asks, if the court thinks the phrase "In God We Trust" is not religious, would they be perfectly okay if Americans said "In Allah We Trust"?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a way of trying to illustrate to people who don't understand what the big deal is about the motto being "In God We Trust," or people who view "In God We Trust" as, or sort of buys into this, this legal fiction that's been put forth by the courts, that somehow "In God We Trust" just doesn't have any religious meaning. It's not significant. It doesn't tell, non-God believers or non-Christians anything, in particular. I mean, it's very hard for people who are either God believers or are Christians or are spiritual but not religious, but don't practice a minority religion or are not atheists. It's very hard to sort of get people, and people like Laura Ingraham, to understand what the big deal is about "In God We Trust" being the national motto, when you don't trust in the Christian God. And saying, hey, how would you feel about the national motto being "In Allah We Trust," sort of kind of thrusts, into the forefront, like, this is an endorsement of a particular God. That's how it feels to people who don't believe in that God. How would you feel if the motto was saying, "In a God you don't believe in, all of us trust"?
Could do "In Thor We Trust," maybe.
Yeah, and that's a thought experiment we often engage in. Just substitute Allah for God or the Quran for the Bible in any no big deal, quote unquote, sort of situation involved, and you see that people have a very, very different reaction.
Right.
And it does blow up the idea that it's not a religious phrase as well. Brittany Babbitts asks, has FFRF ever complained about "In God We Trust" on government property and gotten it removed? Yes, we have. You used to handle these for us.
Yeah, there have been times, yes, we're banging our head against the wall more so with this particular phrase on public property than we are with every other, religious message or object. But there definitely have been times, particularly we're in better shape when we learn about a proposal before the actual display or monument is installed. It's easier to prevent something from happening than to get it undone or removed. That's why, we talk about people fighting against legislation, fighting against proposals when they learn of the actual proposal. And then the second kind of magic ingredient is locals who are engaging, because this is a situation where we don't have as much legal pressure that we can apply, as an organization and as a watchdog group, because there is a ton of court cases out there that are hostile to our position, and any city can, go research this and figure, we're gambling okay here. But what's harder to ignore is, 40 or 50 people who are taxpayers, who are constituents of these city council members or state representatives, who are sitting in the room or who are attending a meeting, giving public comments saying, hey, I live here, I pay taxes here, my kids go to school here, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, I don't want to have to look at this and be marginalized by this every single time that I want to interact with the government that I support and that represents me. That's places where we've been able to drum up a lot of local opposition, are places where there's been success stopping one of these proposals from going through, or one of these displays from going up, or proposing an alternative display like our original motto that was completely secular and unifying and non-religious and non-divisive. Hey, how about this as an alternative, because it alienates no one and actually is a unifying theme.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's impossible to overstate the importance of local activism. That's why we featured Sally on this show prominently. It's that local activism piece is so important when we're trying to stop these. And you're absolutely right. We're far better off stopping something before it goes up than trying to get something removed, which is yet another reason you should text FFRF to 52886 so you can know about these kind of things before they happen.
Right.
So, Cassie Schwartz says, I wonder how Native Americans view the phrase, "In God We Trust." I went to the Native American Museum in D.C. last year, and their exhibits of how Christians used their religion to destroy Native American culture was eye-opening. Isn't it kind of like spitting in minorities' faces to say all Americans trust in God, specifically when religion and God has historically been detrimental? Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Mic drop.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Dan Barker, FFRF co-president, is a Native American. He's part of the Lenape tribe, and he is one of the leading opponents of In God We Trust and has been for decades. So I think he would certainly agree with Cassie. But it is, part of the problem is it is a divisive phrase, and they've taken this unifying idea of e pluribus unum from many different cultures, one nation, from many different states, one nation, and they've just instead rewritten it to exclude anybody who doesn't believe in the Christian God. And that's becoming more and more people as we move forward. There was just a study that Barna released in January saying that 21% of the kids under 19 don't believe in God. They're atheist or agnostic. Not that they're non-religious, that they're atheist or agnostic. And there's another 14% that are non-religious. So you got 1/5 of the American population under 19 that phrase excludes.
Right, and that's not even a number that includes young people practicing an actual minority religion that doesn't worship a Christian God or trust in a Christian God. Doesn't that phrase spit in the face of minority believers and non-believers in our country? Yeah, you bet. That's a really good way to describe your objection to In God We Trust as the national motto. It doesn't represent us all. In fact, it actually suggests that we are all not Americans and we are not patriotic because we're not part of this us.
That's an excellent point. Phil Monroe asks, didn't a Hawaiian activist win a civil rights suit after getting dragged out of a government meeting after protesting an unconstitutional prayer ritual? Phil, you are thinking of Mitch Kale, who is an FFRF lifetime member and a great activist. Yeah. And it wasn't just a legislative meeting. I believe it was the Hawaii legislature that he was protesting the prayer at. And he did get dragged out. And I don't remember if he actually got a court decision or settled it, but I do think he got a pretty solid victory out of it. Mitch is a great activist, and he's now in Michigan doing just as much activism. Actually, more, because there's more to do in Michigan than Hawaii.
How long ago was this? Was this fairly recently? Or?
5 years ago?
Yeah, 5, maybe even longer than that ago, yeah. But yes. Marcus Eastman asks, if In God We Trust was declared unconstitutional, wouldn't it be incredibly costly to get rid of it on currency and on government buildings? Yeah, economic arguments to justify constitutional violations don't really do anything for me as an attorney. A violation of the First Amendment doesn't get to stand because it's expensive to remedy. I mean, you can imagine where we would be with things like segregation and slavery if arguments like that held water. So that doesn't do anything for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation whether it would or wouldn't be costly, although I don't know how costly it is to just stop doing something. Stop printing it on money. Pass a bill. Or, stop renewing the resolution that In God We Trust is our motto every session that you get a chance. Possibly do something else with your legislative time and our tax money and resources.
Excellent point.
Yeah, removing things from, removing that enormously obnoxious In God We Trust from the Wentzville dais. Yeah, that might take a couple city workers a couple hours. Yeah, I guess I'm not moved either.
So we have an anonymous question which says, if I text you to help on this issue, will you sell my information or add me to a bunch of email lists? That's actually a good question. It's a fair question. No, we will not. And any information that comes into FFRF about our membership or that comes in through the legal web form, we protect that very, very carefully. So your information will not be sold. It will only be used for FFRF. If there is a bill or a legislative measure in your area, we'll let you know. You'll get a text from us, and then you'll be able to, right from your phone, call in, email, and tweet at or Facebook post to your local and state and federal representatives. So really a good question, fair question. I'm glad you asked it. It's something we should say. So.
And just to add to what Andrew said, we've been proud historically about not sharing information, not asking people for money just because we have their information, and we've been unique among nonprofits in making very sure of that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We have a unrelated question, a topic unrelated to the question. It's from Rick Janney. He asks, aren't churches crossing the line in respect to politics? And if so, what efforts are there to get them to pay their fair share of taxes? So it's a little bit of a broad question. On the tax question, I'll just throw out there that the Supreme Court has already said that if the federal government, if Congress wants to allow charities, including charities like FFRF, to be tax exempt, it's perfectly acceptable to include churches within that broad category. It's not unconstitutional to give churches a tax break because of that. So there's very low likelihood that churches are going to be paying taxes as a result of a constitutional challenge. That said, there are many court decisions which hint at the idea that churches do not have a right to a tax exemption. So if it wanted to be removed legislatively, it seems like that could certainly be a possibility. And then in terms of, actually we got another question that I'm going to move on to that's better because we've done the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah, watch
to
our
death.
Ask an Atheist about the Johnson Amendment if you're interested in churches politicking, and read up on what FFRF has done, especially through litigation, to challenge iniquities in tax obligations between secular nonprofits like FFRF and churches. Yes, we're both tax exempt, but secular nonprofits like FFRF do have to undertake way more onerous obligations, as we should, to enjoy the privilege of tax exemption. Churches do not. So you can read up on what we've done on that front and what we're still engaged in.
Yeah, and the Johnson Amendment is actually under threat. We sent out a text action alert to everybody who's texted in last night, so they got that information. Congress is considering yet another measure to try to repeal the Johnson Amendment, something that we've been fighting back against all year. And that does it for our questions for this week. So I think that's going to do it for this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. We will be back next week with another episode on a topic that is to be decided. If you've got ideas, go ahead and throw them in the comments and we'll consider them. Until then, see you next week.